he is just an elegant young seducer with no manly virtues whatsoever. He may have some artistic talents, but usually it is beauty and beauty only that is his asset. Here you have a scene actually from the Iliad, the so-called teichoscopia, or watching from the ramparts of the city. This is the scene when Helen is standing over the walls of Troy in company of Priamus. She's explaining more or less who is who on the battlefield. This is a very common way of presenting Helen in this scene, with a complete lack of any facial expression. This is, after all, one husband of hers behind her in the besieged city. This is, after all, the other husband of hers down there on the plains of Troy. They are about to fight once again. They've been fighting for 10 years. And she has no feeling about it whatsoever. She is the tool. She is the tool of gods. She is the tool of fate. She doesn't do anything herself. This woman, who has very strong feelings, either negative or positive, has disappeared. She's completely passive. As I say, a tool and nothing else. We talked for a moment about the various ways of presenting Helen's arrival to Troy, that she was either forced or she came on her own, and the tradition of European culture kept both of those. Here in the 16th century painting, you see Helen being carried away against her will out of Sparta to be taken to Troy. And who is this person here? Who is it? Who is this person here?
Aphrodite?
Yes, it's Aphrodite. It's Aphrodite, the reason for what is happening. Look at the pose. This is the pose. If you take the upper part of the body, the lower one, from her breasts down, is the pose of the famous Capitoline Venus. The famous, there's a number of copies of this work of art. Copy of Praxiteles. This is Aphrodite, yes, the reason for all this happening. At almost the same time, 100 years later, you have Guido Reni's Helen. This is Helen and Paris coming to Troy. Does she look to you like a woman going not of her free will? It's like a walk, isn't it? Paris is holding her hand, and they are going together. And there's a little... Yes, there's Amor. And look at the way he's looking at us, because he's looking at us. He's looking at the viewer, at the public, and he is almost like, don't spoil the game. And there's a little animal, which is most certainly not a cat, probably a monkey, and a little dog about to fight with it. And there's a little black page boy, and everything an elegant lady may have. She looks like she's going for a walk with her attire. In fact, she's running away from her husband. This is Helen as a character from the Iliad. So she is not taken out of the context. The scenes are recognizable. They can be used as some kind of illustration. But Helen can be taken out of the context and presented simply as a beauty, usually cold, disdainful, not quite friendly. You can see her here. This is a very interesting painting. If it's not interesting artistically, I do not say it is. It is interesting if you look at the iconography. you have roses here and doves and a mirror. These three are attributes of whom in Greek tradition and in a later iconographical tradition? Which goddess has roses, doves, and a mirror as her attributes, among her attributes?
Aphrodite.
Aphrodite, yes, this is Helen with Aphrodite's attributes. You can't see it really because the copy is as it is, but on this mirror there is actually an image of Aphrodite here. And there's a moon, as you can see, stressing Helen's association, which was commonly, it was taken at face value and believed to be very common in the 19th century, Helen's association with the moon. If you look at her, she is in a, it's not a Greek dress, it's not even a Roman dress. It's something that is meant to be a cross between a very fashionable dress and something resembling Greek attire in a pink color. And she's looking at herself in the mirror. She's admiring her hair. Once again, the gesture is similar to that of Aphrodite drying her hair on a very typical visual representation of the goddess. But here you can see that everything points at Helen looking in the mirror and saying, "Oh, how pretty I am," admiring her own beauty. While the associations with Aphrodite stress not only the beauty, but also the romantic rather than erotic appeal of the goddess. Here you have another Helen with a rather unpleasant facial expression. But once again, this is Helen meant to be a beauty. This is Helen with adornments and jewelry resembling what was believed to be Greek, and what was often represented as Greek art, as Greek jewelry. And once again with a rose, a flower of Aphrodite, in her hair. Look at the fact that they are both more or less red-haired. This goes a bit beyond the description in the Iliad, which makes Helen blonde. She's blonde, she's fair-haired. She's blonde because it's rare in Greece. It's atypical, therefore it's beautiful. Achilles is blonde too. He is in fact xanthos, which may mean blonde or may mean red-haired. But why is she red-haired? She's red-haired because for the period, a red-haired woman is a perfect beauty, but also a perfect temptress. Red hair is a color for a woman who is dangerous, who is seductive, who would want to dominate the man. And you have, surprisingly rarely, we have evil Helen in the cinema. You would think that Helen as femme fatale would be something obvious, something absolutely expected, something quite common. Surprisingly enough, it is not so. If Helen is not the main character, she may be evil. She is evil in an episode of Xena the Warrior Princess, for example. But if she is the main character, she is always good. She's a good woman. Sometimes a woman treated unjustly, very often just a good woman. In this movie, the 1956 American-Italian epic film called Helen of Troy, directed by many Oscar-nominated and 2 Oscar-winner director Robert Wise. She is a woman who is noble and just and beautiful, and she falls in love with a charming, brave young general named Paris, who is the peace envoy. The countries of Helen's husband Menelaus, which is obviously Greece, yeah, it's Greece, it's not Sparta, it's Greece, end of Paris's Troy are at war. This cruel war should end, so peace negotiations are planned, and Paris comes, and Helen falls in love with him. And finally Paris gets cruelly and brutally and unjustly killed by Menelaus, and Helen finds the only solace in the fact that she will soon die and be joined with her beloved in the afterlife. You have Helen here, as played by the 22-year-old at the time Italian actress Rossana Podesta, who didn't really make any greater career, although she was for many years a popular actress in Italy. This movie is much better remembered by the fact that a small part of Helen's handmaiden was played by a very young French actress named Brigitte Bardot. You have Helen here. She was apparently chosen for her beauty. You can't see it because it's, the movie was in color, but the photo is black and white. Her hair is blonde, this golden blonde hair, which becomes a staple for screen Helens, with some exceptions. You'd think that in the cynical 21st century things will change. No, they didn't. Helen is still blonde, still innocent, still noble and still loving, and she is still a good character, and she is still played by a pretty and not that talented actress. Diane Kruger is not a bad actress. She played a number of roles in small movies, which proved it. But I don't think there was any way to be a good actor in this movie. This is officially my second most hated ancient movie ever. And I thought nothing will ever, take it out of the first place, but then I saw Oliver Stone's Alexander. That did it. If you remember that movie, and some of you may, since it is one of the favorite movies of my most respected colleague Antoni Bobrowski, who made, when he was still teaching ancient culture, every year students were watching Troy and writing reviews of it. Little actually has changed during those 50 years, from the Robert Wise movie to that of Wolfgang Petersen. Menelaus is still cruel, brutal, and unloving. Helen is still beautiful, noble, and very much in love with Paris. Paris is maybe a little less heroic, but he is still charming, he is still good-hearted, he may be a little reckless. If you remember that terrifying movie, it is Hector, who is the main good character in it. Paris is nice, but he's not a hero, he's not a warrior at all. And a proper choice of actor for that, I believe. This movie was famously to become a proper version of the Iliad without the gods, which made the thing not work at all. And sometimes we may have Helen, who is more stereotypically like a femme fatale, and I mentioned Star Trek and I mentioned Captain Kirk. Let's have Helen from season 3 of Star Trek, 1968, and the episode, I think this is the 68th episode in general of Star Trek, so that would be somewhere in the middle of the season 3, which is, if I may say so, not the best Star Trek season, to put it mildly. We have a story about a certain Elan of Troyes, who is a princess. There are 2 planets. The planets are at war. One is inhabited by savage, brutal and cruel humans, among whom women are even more savage, brutal and cruel. The other planet is inhabited by a cultured, refined and tolerant race of reptile-looking aliens. And both planets are placed on the border of the Federation, close to the Klingon Empire. So there's politics, very, very typical Star Trek politics. Either there will be war or there won't be war. At the backstory, the war is supposed to be solved in a typical fairy tale way. An politically important woman from one planet will marry a politically important man from the other, only she doesn't want to. She stabs her husband-to-be. She stabs Captain Kirk. She dares to stab Captain Kirk. You can see her here. She looks, as you can see, brutal, barbaric, and very, very dangerous. At least according to Star Trek standards. And she carries her knives everywhere. For now, the story resembles more some kind of fairy tale about the prince and the princess and their need to marry. But additional element is added, or two elements. Firstly, there is a sabotage aboard the Enterprise, the starship, Captain Kirk. The sabotage organized, as it turns out, by Ellen's lover, who cannot accept her marriage. He wants to steal her back, but he dies in an attempt to destroy the ship engines. He incapacitates them. I will not tell the whole dilithium crystals and the rest of the Star Trek technobabble story, because it's not important. What is important is that this Ellen here has a certain quality. At some point somebody, I'm not quite sure who that is, asks the obvious and logical question. If these women are so savage, so cruel, so brutal, if they attack their future husbands with knives, why would anyone want to marry them? It turns out they have a magical property. Their tears are addictive. I mean, if a tear from the eye of such a woman would fall on a man's skin, this man gets addicted to that woman and attracted to her forever. She is irresistible, just like Helen. You can't really protest. You can't really use your mind. You have no mind. You are a slave to the desire for that woman. They should have probably dressed her differently for such an idea. But still, when this lover of her dies, she starts weeping. So she becomes a typical damsel in distress who is sitting in the dark and crying, and our brave hero, Captain Kirk, comes to the rescue. He is trying to cheer her up, in the process of which her tears fall on his hands. And he's supposed, from now on, to be addicted to her. She is trying to use her influence to force him to destroy the planet of her future husband, but he's resisting her bravely, which is, if I may say so, not a very typical behavior for this very character. He usually faces temptation by yielding to it. In this case, he is resisting. And observing how bravely he is fighting with his addiction, she becomes sweet, mild and kind female. She decides to marry her prospective husband. I mean, once he gets out of the hospital, cured from the stab that she gave him. She decides to guarantee the peace in this part of galaxy, and at the end she hands her knife to Kirk, telling him that the good wives of Troyes do not carry weapons. This is, of course, very stereotypical This is, of course, very conventional. The name of the character is an obvious allusion to Helen of Troy, but the story resembles actually, apart from this detail that she is an irresistibly beautiful woman who brings strife, war and conflict, the story as such resembles more The Taming of the Shrew by Shakespeare than any variation on Helen's fate. Still, we have here Helen, luckily not blonde, Helen who is a bit more, a bit closer to that archetype of femme fatale, of the evil woman who is bringing disaster and war upon men. And two more short things to be mentioned. There's a rather lovely operetta by Jacob Offenbach called La Belle Hélène, which is, once again, Helen is pretty silly and in love. Menelaus is an idiot. Kind of bureaucrat, boring. He has no time for the wife. He has it coming. When she leaves him, I mean, he works really hard for it. And Paris is a charming, if not quite cultured, shepherd who is an epitome of manly values. He is uncouth, he is a bit wild, he is domineering, he is a stereotypical image of what a woman may want in a man, or not so, what a woman may want in a lover. This is the around mid-19th century, and for many years this work had a reputation of being immoral, of being erotic, and in the memoirs of a famous Polish writer of children's stories, Konrad Makuszyński, there's a lovely story about how him and his classmates in the high school, so they were about 16, 17, had an ambition of getting tickets for La Belle Hélène for the local opera house, and nobody would sell it to them because they were underage, and there was a gossip that for a second the actress who plays Helen shows her breasts. That, just like the other of the most famous comic works of Offenbach, Orpheus in the Underworld, this was believed by many to be an offense. On one hand, an offense to public morality. On the other, an offense to the great tradition of antiquity. One of the greatest French reviewers and critics of classical music call these works offensive to the human spirit. And just at the very end, I said that this image of Helen, or the variation of it showing Helen as a beauty, first and foremost, dominates. So at the very end I will mention one of my own favorite poets. It doesn't mean that she's always a good poet. Not always, at all. The poet who usually used just her initials, HD, her name was Hilda Doolittle. She lived in the first half of the 20th century, and she was an American poet closely associated with the circle of Ezra Pound, of whom she was a life partner for a short time before they split up. She wrote a lot, she had episodes of psychiatric problems, and she was very much inspired by various ancient themes. I translated myself a number of her poems, in case anybody wanted to see them. I did not translate her long narrative poem about Helen in Egypt. That's the title of it, actually, in which Helen is an archetype of a woman. It is called often a feminist reading, if we may indeed speak of a feminist work from the beginning of the 20th century. This is a pre-World War II poem, if I remember correctly. Helen is, in this poem, Helen is a woman who falls in love, marries, gets disappointed, finds a lover. On the other hand, she is also a wise woman, a woman who travels to Egypt, the seat of all wisdom, who gets some kind of knowledge of this primeval, basic knowledge about humanity and human nature, which is on one hand taken from the Egyptian tradition, on the other is simply a result of her being down to earth, close to life. She loses her first daughter because she leaves her. Then she becomes this queen of Leuke, and so on and so on. And here, Helen is she is a positive character, a positive force in a way, but in a completely different way than she is, say, in Petersen's Troy. It is not so that she is a special, most beautiful woman in the world who fell in love with this beautiful Orlando Bloom character. She is just a woman, every woman. A representation, a mirror of every female. Not a special female at all. Not the only mortal daughter of Zeus. Not the only one whose beauty is irresistible. Every woman is Helen. It is not so only that Helen is every woman, but every woman is like Helen. Thank you very much. It was very nice to see you.